Okay, we're continuing with this book here, The British Imagination by Watson, book review. Some of these slides I showed you before, but I'll just briefly go through them again to make it all make sense. We're going through a lot of the literary figures. This guy right here is Leo Damrosch, Harvard professor. This is one of the books he wrote. He actually wrote two books I'm going to show you today. This one here is called The Club, and the main star of the show is Samuel Johnson. So Samuel Johnson was the big guy who wrote the Dictionary of the English Language, the first good dictionary of English. Buswell is the Scotsman who was the great biographer for Samuel Johnson. We're going to talk a lot about Edward Gibbons tonight as well, and a little bit about Edmund Burke. Okay. So this was the club where these guys would meet, and they're primarily literary figures, but Samuel Johnson, of course, he's a big guy in person and a big guy intellectually. Okay. Buswell was his biographer. Joshua Reynolds was the great portrait painter from England. Edmund Burke was the Irish member of Parliament. He was sort of both Catholic and Protestant. Adam Smith was the great economist, one of the founders of the ideas of capitalism, even though capitalism was figured out hundreds of years before him in less detail by the Catholic Church with their international trade. Edward Gibbon, the great historian of England. Oliver Smith, the Irish playwright. Richard Brinsley Sheridan, Irish playwright. David Garrick, the actor. So they had a pretty big bunch of celebrity hotshots there. Okay, so some of the quotes here from Samuel Johnson. He says, "Oats is a grain in England which is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people." Okay, so they're always making fun of the Scottish. Patrick Allett, the English historian, calls Scotland and Wales the Celtic fringes of England. Okay, so now here's what Samuel Johnson has to say. "A man ought to read just as inclination leads him, for what he reads as a task will do him little good." You forget almost everything that you're forced to read for school. You remember what you read out of your own interest. He said, "A young man should read at least 5 hours a day, and in so doing he may acquire a great deal of knowledge." Yeah, you got to have the leisure time. That's why in order to have top-notch intellectuals, people have to have enough specialization that some people can grow the food and do all the other work so that somebody's got time to read. The chief glory of every people arises from its authors. Okay, and here's Samuel Johnson continuing. "All of our religion, almost all of our law, almost all of our arts, almost everything that sets us above the savages has come from the shores of the Mediterranean. I think that all Christians agree in the essential articles and that the differences are trivial. Christianity is the highest perfection of humanity." I would agree with that. What matters about Christianity is the teaching of Christ. Be nice to each other, get along, love thy neighbor. That which you do to least of my brethren, you do unto me. In Genesis, all men are created in the image of God. Most of the rest of the Bible, parts of it matter, but they don't matter that much. Nobody really cares if, what the communion wafer represents, etc., etc. The applause of a single human is of great consequence. Whatever enlarges hope will exalt courage. Self-confidence is the first requisite to great undertakings. Yeah, you got to believe you can do it. You got to believe there's hope. That's why people need to learn about their ancestors, their great achievements, and then they're inspired to try to do something great themselves. If they just hang around in a loser pop culture where nobody does anything interesting or significant, then there's no awareness that it's possible to do anything interesting or significant. All intellectual improvement arises from leisure. Kindness is in our power, but fondness is not. You can be nice to everybody, but you can't make yourself like or love somebody. Either you do or you don't. But you can be nice to everybody. As I know more of mankind, I expect less of them, and am ready now to call a man good upon easier terms than I was formerly. What you realize if you're educated is that most people are not educated. They're never going to be educated. They're never going to read anything. For the average stupid person, to read a book would be like a punishment, okay? So they're just not going to be intellectually developed. That's why the grade school and high school are so important, but they've currently been taken over by the billionaire perverts to turn everybody into morons, and that's why there's so few educated people nowadays. People in general do not read if they can have anything else to amuse themselves. Yeah, I've sort of sadly seen that. I know people who the number one thing they need to do is read, and they won't do it. It's just like they won't go vegan. I see all these people, they're sick with all these problems, obesity, diabetes, coronary artery disease, hypertension off the charts, heart disease, kidney failure, and they won't go vegan. And I'm like, and then they come to me for advice. I'm like, I give you advice, you don't take my advice. What do you want me to tell you? Go take your pills, have your surgery, have fun, okay? I can't help it. I can't get through to you. That's your problem, not mine. Self-confidence is the first requisite to great undertakings. Great works are performed by perseverance. If nothing may be published but that which authority shall have previously approved, then power will always be the standard of truth. Yeah, and that's kind of the position we find ourselves in these days. You can't get a standard publisher book published unless you make it wimpy and conformist and weak. You publish anything strong, they won't publish it. Biography is the kind of writing that is most eagerly read and most easily applied to the purposes of life. Yeah, I would say when you don't know what to read biographies. There is nothing more dreadful to an author than neglect. To be unnoticed is starvation for an author. It is seldom that the great or wise suspect that they are despised or cheated. The greatest part of mankind have no other reason for their opinions except that they are in fashion. All judgment is comparative. That's a good one. All judgment is comparative. That's how we process information in our brain, by comparing it to other things. The supreme end of education is expert discernment in all things, the power to tell the good from the bad and to prefer the good. One of the most remarkable things you see on the internet is how many people lie. And the reason they lie is because they're trying to do it for money. And if you're trying to make money off of education, then you kind of have to lie, because you can't make money educating people about the truth. It's very difficult. Or you can kind of tell them part of the truth. The more truth you tell, the more likely you're ostracized, shadow banned, or simply rejected by the audience. It's just a fact. Okay, in life there is much to be endured and little to be enjoyed. You can never be wise unless you love reading. You can be emotionally, socially wise, but you can never be intellectually wise. Nothing will ever be attempted if all objections must first be overcome. Yep, I agree with all that, man. If you want to do something, you got to go for it and accept the fact that you're never going to have all your ducks in a row. You just got to go. All right, here's Edmund Burke, the great Irishman, who was a member of Parliament in England. He was a famous orator. And here's what Samuel Johnson said of him. You cannot stand 5 minutes with Edmund Burke beneath a shed while it rains and not be convinced that you were standing next to the greatest man you had ever seen. Okay, so here's Edmund Burke's quotes. Rudeness is the weak man's imitation of strength. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do little. Those who do not know history are destined to repeat it. People will not look forward to posterity if they have not looked back to their ancestors. Yeah, so if you don't teach people about the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans and the Italian Renaissance and the great age of the 1800s, then they're not aware that greatness is possible for humans. Because the achievements of the ancient Greeks and of the Italian Renaissance and of the 1800s are so far superior to what's happening in the modern era in general that the average young person is not aware that you could do anything great. I never was really fully aware that intellectual greatness was even like a possible goal until I got older and I started, took my Western civilization course and I started to get a sense of things. So I should have been exposed to all that stuff at a younger age. I wish I was. Show me one absurdity in religion and I will show you 100 in political laws and institutions. True religion is the foundation of society. The age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded. And the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. Learning will be cast into the mire and trodden down under the hoofs of a swinish multitude. Man is by his design a religious animal. Atheism is not only against our reason, but it is against our instincts. When religion is removed from society, the whole fabric cannot be stable or lasting. Among a people generally corrupt, liberty cannot long last. Despots rule by force. They know that he who fears God fears nothing else. Therefore, they try to eradicate God from the people's mind using their Voltaire. Voltaire was an evil piece of crap. He helped destroy France. French people still love the guy, and don't get me wrong, he was a very clever writer, he was funny, he did say and do some good things, but his general overall impact on France was terribly bad. Him and Diderot and Rousseau and those other scumbags, the philosophes with their encyclopedia. Scumbags, man, they destroyed France. Atheism destroys every country. Look at USA. It's becoming atheism, and it's going down in the garbage can. You have to have religion or you don't have a country. There is no safety for honest men except by believing all possible evil of evil men. When bad men combine, the good must associate, else they will fall one by one in an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle. Early and provident fear is the mother of safety. The concessions of the weak are the concessions of fear. It is the nature of all greatness not to be exact. It is a general popular error to imagine that the loudest complainers for the public good are actually the most anxious for its welfare. Yeah, most of the time they're just a despot in disguise. Example is the school of mankind, and they will learn it no other. All right, those are some good Edmund Burke quotes. We're almost done here. I'm going to do a little bit of Edward Gibbons. So there's the book Damrose wrote about him, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So basically he made a super abridged version of Edward Gibbons' book. And it is a historical landmark. So here's Edward Gibbons. And, in some ways he was a brilliant guy. In other ways he's sort of a fat Protestant scumbag. Transiently he was Catholic, but he tried to blame the fall of Rome on the Catholics. And it's like, kiss my butt, pal. That's not the reason Rome fell. They had so many other problems in Rome. All right, he went on a grand tour of Rome, and he saw Rome having fallen when he was a wealthy young man. He was wealthy enough he had time to read and study, and he's like, why did Rome fall? So he dedicated his life to studying the fall of Rome, and he wrote these big, voluminous works on the subject. And he noticed that what Augustus did, Octavian Caesar, he would just change the name of an institution, and people liked the idea of being told you had freedom, but you could take away all the freedom as long as you told them they had freedom. It's kind of like that in the modern world. You can tell people you have free speech, but not allow them to say anything, and they believe they have free speech. That's how stupid people are. Gibbons was pretty overrated. He had somewhat of a Latin style of writing English, so a lot of passive voice, and I find him kind of cumbersome. I read an abridged version of his book. I was not that impressed by it. Okay, let's see a couple quotes of Gibbon. He says, a barbarian is a man uncivilized, untaught, a savage. He says, the educated man by reading and reflection multiplies his own existence and lives in distant ages and other remote countries, while the illiterate is rooted to a single spot and confined to a few years of existence and surpasses but very little his fellow laborer, the ox, in the exercise of his mental faculties. Every man who rises above the common level has had two educations, the first from his teachers, and the second, more personal, more important, from himself. Yeah, you got to read a ton to be knowledgeable about anything. Conversation enriches understanding, but solitude is the school of genius. If we were to call upon what area in the history of the world was the human race most happy and prosperous, it would be without hesitation. I would name the time between the death of Domitian and the accession of Commodus. The Catholic Church denounced Calvin, but they made a saint of Augustine, even though it's difficult to tell their arguments apart, even with a theological microscope. Yeah, but Calvin was killing people for heresy, okay? Calvin was a bad guy. Okay. As Jacques Barzun had said, Calvin was Lenin, evil, and Calvin was a destroyer of art. Yeah, and Martin Luther was like Marx. Okay, Edward Gibbons, a few more quotes from him. Persuasion is the resource of the feeble, and the feeble can seldom persuade. So he never had kids. He was this morbidly obese atheist. He got a scrotal hydrofil infected, and he died in his 50s. So anyways, but he's somebody, if you're going to study England, if you're going to study the 1800s, he came out of the 1700s, though, you're going to encounter all these guys. These are all big names in that big built-up history of English literature, so it's good to know about them. Hope you found that helpful.